Another witness taking the stand at the Walter Rodney Commission of Inquiry has blamed the Forbes-Burnham People's National Congress government for the assassination of international scholar Dr. Walter Rodney. Dr. Omawali, a former Working People's Alliance WPA member and colleague of Dr. Rodney, testified of the oppressive dictatorship that hovered Guyana during the 1970s and 80s. Dr. Omawali, entering the witness box on day 6 of the 6th session, October 28, 2014, of the Walter Rodney Commission of Inquiry, spoke of the discriminatory employment policies, state control of media, and every aspect of life in Guyana under the People's National Congress regime. Dr. Omawali told the Commission that the constant harassment of the Working People's Alliance members was seen as a form of punishment meted out by the dictatorship at that time.
Could you paint the picture for us about the press? Was there free press, and how many radio stations and newspapers and so on there were in Guyana at the time?
At that time, I think we had 2 radio stations, and one of them seemed to be more controlled by the government than the other. So I was interviewed by one of those radio stations, as I recall. Newspapers, I don't recall there being more than, apart from the party newspapers, the People's Progressive Party had the Mirror, the People's National Congress had a paper, and then there was the Chronicle, and there might have been the Graphic at the time still in existence.
And was there any control of, apart from the party's newspapers, was there any control of the newspapers?
There was significant control. In fact, my next interaction with the state at that level was in 1979, when, or 70, would have been around about 1979, when there was a shortage of many items, including newsprint.
He said Dr. Walter Rodney was a victim of terror by the state under Burnham, who saw him as a threat to the regime. The former WPA organizing secretary told commissioners that Rodney was against racial solutions to address the social problems in society and never had a violent inclination.
It is quite obvious that the most charismatic and admired person in the Working People's Alliance would probably have been Walter Rodney. I'm talking about to the population at large. But Walter would never accept that as a reason for him to be regarded as the leader. And his interest was always in the self-emancipation of the working people. So he was a teacher, and he felt by teaching and inspiring, people would assert their own rights and advance themselves.
Pressed by Commissioner Sinat Jairam as to who or what he believed was responsible for Rodney's June 13, 1980 death, Dr. Omawali ruled out the People's Progressive Party as a suspect.
Would you rule out the PPP as far as you are concerned? Completely?
I have no reason to suspect that the PPP was involved. No knowledge or any reason to suspect that.
And who would you blame?
Absolutely the state, led by the PNC and Forbes-Burnham.
Is there any other entity or person who may have posed a threat to Walter's safety and health at the time that you know of?
Not that I'm aware of.
Giving an example of state oppression, Dr. Omawali pointed to instances of subversion of the academic process at the University of Guyana, citing racial profiling as a main control mechanism of the Burnham government.
Your statement goes on, Dr. Omawali, to the subversion of the university, and you speak of your experience sitting on the academic board and the board of governors of the University of Guyana. Now, could you explain to us what forms of oppression you experienced while sitting on the academic board?
Well, I was addressing the subversion of the university. For example, we had medical technology department, and we were identifying students to be admitted for studies in medical technology. And one of the persons who was involved in the selection, who was really representing the government, and whom I knew, requested the application documents of the students and confided in me because I was a member of ASCRI and he thought that I was therefore very sympathetic to anti-Indian activity and the anti-Indo-Guyanese activity. And he wanted to use the names of the students to disqualify those who might have been Indo-Guyanese and make sure that all Afro-Guyanese applicants would be successful. And he used the list, but unfortunately, as things happen in Guyana, at least 2 of those people with apparently African names turned out to be Indian. And he was very upset. And so subsequently, he requested photographs so that he could identify the people. Exactly.
So that there would be no mistaking the name
Precisely.
Attached to a particular race.
Exactly. And I regard that as a subversion of the academic activities of the university.
Would you care to name the individual who confided this to you?
Not really, madam.
Okay. No difficulty.
If it's important, he was a Dr. Monroe, but I don't think that that was important to name.
Okay. This sort of racial profiling in terms of applicants for the medical technology, are you aware of if this sort of selection process was applied to the hiring of staff as opposed to applicants who want to join the program?
The selection was applied to academic appointments, yes, but not necessarily in the same kind of crude way, but yes, definitely.
Basis on which you say so, you say that Dr. Omawali, that it was applied to the university staff?
Well, on the Board of Governors, the government was represented. And if the academic board, as in the case of the appointment of Dr. Rodney, suggested something that was not what the government wanted, the Board of Governors would see that it would not be done.
He also spoke of his experience of harassment and surveillance by state agencies.
And I, as a consultant to the Food and Agriculture Organization, at the end of one-year contracts, I would come home to Guyana. And on one of those occasions, which was in 1979, I believe, various events, which I'm sure you will discuss later, prevented me from leaving Guyana to go back to assume my position as a consultant. And so I threw my weight fully into the activities of the Working People's Alliance.
You were prevented from leaving the country. Around what year was that? We can discuss it now. What year was that?
It would have been in 1979, the first occasion, as I recall.
1979.
Yeah, I went to the airport, and my passport was taken. I was shunted into a room, and they refused to let me onto the flight. Flight left, and I had to return to Georgetown.
Now, where were you going during that particular trip?
I was attempting to return to Rome, where I was working with the Food and Agriculture Organization.
And this was...
I'm sorry, some of it got a little garbled. I was attempting to return to Rome where?
I was a consultant for the Food and Agriculture Organization.
Thank you.
Were you given a reason for being denied boarding on the aircraft?
My name was on a list. That's the reason we were usually given. And then we would be told, you need to go and speak to some higher authority. So we were just not allowed onto the aircraft.
I would have thought from a practical point of view, if you were giving trouble, they should only be too happy to see you go.
Control doesn't always have logic informing it.
So you were given in this room, for example, on that occasion, when you were attempted to return to Rome, and you were shunted into the room, to use your language, all you were told is that your name was on a list. Didn't you inquire further to say, why is my name on the list? Did they volunteer any additional information?
They didn't volunteer any additional information. And Madam Commissioner, the atmosphere at the time was such that I would not ask anyway because I understood, I knew what was happening. And so I might have been party to no further explanation because we never got answers.
And may I further ask, when you say you were told to go and speak to a higher authority, was the office or individual ever identified to you, or you were supposed to just leave it there?
I don't recall a specific individual on that occasion being identified.
And no office?
No, not specifically.
Not the office holder, not the office?
Not really.
I thank you. About for how long, it's a long time, so if you can't recall, I would understand. About for how long were you in this room?
Until the flight left.
And
That might have been an hour or so, I would think, maybe.
And was your passport ever returned?
It was returned, yes.
That same day after the flight left or later on?
After the flight left, I was given my passport and I came back to Georgetown with it.
Thank you.
Further pressed by the Assistant Lead Counsel to the Commission on aspects of the terms of reference, the former WPA member maintained that the state killed Rodney.
Dr. Omowale, at this time, I wish to take you through some of the terms of reference that this commission has and its mandate to inquire into these issues. We have gone through a bit of term of reference 1, but I'll read it back, and if there's anything you wish to add in relation to terms of reference 1, I would invite you to do so. It says, to examine the facts and circumstances immediately prior, at the time of, and subsequent to the death of Dr. Walter Rodney, in order to determine, as far as possible, who or what was responsible for the explosion resulting in the death of Dr. Walter Rodney. Are you able at this time, Dr. Omowale, to assist us in the circumstances immediately prior to, at the time of, or subsequent to the death of Dr. Walter Rodney, that would offer us insight in relation to who or what was responsible for the explosion that resulted in the death of Dr. Rodney?
Council, the only contribution I could make in this regard is what I've already offered, that there was a certain climate. There was a certain climate in which we were living and which was pervasive that would lead one to understand that the state would have been responsible for the killing of Walter Rodney.
And you rely on all the examples and the instances of the assassinations you refer to, and also the incidents of harassment that you described as oppressive. You're relying on those in relation to offering that particular opinion.
Precisely, ma'am.
Term of reference.
I think the verb there
Yeah.
doesn't use would be responsible for, as opposed to was responsible for.
Was responsible.
No, I want you to put that to it because they may have a slightly different meaning.
Understand, Mr. Chairman. And for the purposes of the record, who or what was responsible for the explosion resulting in the death of Dr. Walter Rodney?
I believe it was the state under the leadership of the PNC and Forbes Burnham.
Mr.
And
Chair,
you have explained that this belief is based on the evidence you have given us earlier.
Exactly, about the environment and the incidences that I have personal knowledge of.
Thank you.
term of reference 2, which was read to you already by Mr. Chairman, but I'll go through it again. To inquire into the cause of the explosion in which Dr. Walter Rodney died, whether it was an act of terrorism, and if so, who were the perpetrators?
I could only have an opinion about that. I'm not privy to any facts that would bear upon the matter.
And your opinion on this issue is?
As before, that it was actually an agent of the state that was exercising the desire of the leadership of the PNC and the president to be rid of Walter Rodney.
To be rid of Walter Rodney.
Dr. Omowali and other WPA members were arrested in connection with the burning down of the building that housed the Ministry of National Development and the office of the PNC's General Secretary. He recounted protests outside the Bedford-Wacton police station where WPA members chanted, "People's power, no dictator." Dr. Omowali said Burnham employed scare tactics in a bid to maintain his dominance. He said this permeated the atmosphere to the point where persons opposed to the dictatorship became fearful for their lives and those of their families. Omowali testified that a popular line used by Burnham, quote, "make your wills," unquote, was taken seriously by some persons who took out life insurance policies.
Public meetings that we had after that, the PNC had a chant, tick-tock, tick-tock, and things of that nature, ridiculing the Working People's Alliance and suggesting that Walter Rodney met his just desserts and stuff of this nature.
Once again, the threats by death squad members and beatings by House of Israel members was brought to the fore. During cross-examination by attorney Christopher Ram, who represents the WPA, Dr. Omowali said the finding of the 1988 coroner's inquest, which states that Dr. Rodney died from misadventure, does not change his belief that the state was responsible for Rodney's death.
Was it always your opinion that Dr. Rodney was assassinated?
From the 14th of June, 1980, I came to that conclusion.
Has there been anything in the 34 years since Dr. Rodney's death that has caused you to revise your opinion of that event?
Nothing whatsoever.
You know there was an inquest.
Has it been strengthened though?
It has been strengthened from the information that I read of, including information coming out of this inquiry.
Yes, sir. There was an inquest into Dr. Rodney's death. You're aware of that?
I understand there was, yes.
And that the coroner found that the cause of death was due to misadventure.
I've read that.
Did that have any impact on your conviction that Dr. Rodney was assassinated?
None whatsoever, because I regarded that the inquest being controlled in the context of dictatorship by the government and the state.
What about the 1981 trial of Donald Rodney? Did that change your view?
That travesty just confirmed my view that it was the state responsible.
The former WPA member was questioned by attorney Andrew Pilgrim, who represents the Rodney family. He was also cross-examined by attorney Keith Scotland, who represents the interests of Donald Rodney. Scotland questioned the rationale behind Dr. Omowali's reference to Donald Rodney's trial as a travesty. To this end, he said he believed that Donald was a victim of the same system that killed Walter.
Dr. Omowali, I represent the interest of Donald Rodney. You referred to his trial as a travesty. Could you explain to this commission why you referred to Donald Rodney's trial? And when we say trial, we mean the trial for the possession of explosives under the then, let me get the correct act. Under the then National Security Miscellaneous Provision Act. He was tried under that act for possession of explosives.
I think it was section 23.
Section 23, subsection 1. Why would you refer to his trial? Take your time and explain to us as a travesty.
I regard Donald as being a victim of the same act that killed Walter Rodney, and therefore to charge him with being responsible for anything related to that, I regard as being a travesty.
And you would agree with me that when you say that, it would be true to say that you are coming from an angle where you yourself at the time was charged with an arson. which you obviously, from your statement, you had nothing to do with. You were elsewhere and you went to sleep, and then you got up and you went somewhere else to sleep on the night.
Yes, but I think for Donald it was worse because he was a victim of a circumstance for which he was being implicated as
So
being
you-
responsible.
So you would put Donald's situation even worse than your situation.
Absolutely.
Assistant Lead Counsel to the Commission, Lachmir Ahmed, summed up the day's proceedings.
Well, first and foremost, Dr. Umawali was also one of the founding members of the WPA. When he took the stand today, he sought to tell the members of the commission what his personal experiences were living under the Burnham dictatorship. Throughout his written statement, he referred to the time as being a dictatorship, and he even referred to Mr. Burnham as being a bully. He spoke about his own personal experience when he tried to organize a rally when Dr. Clive Thomas was ousted from his position at UWI Mona campus. In support of that action, they organized a rally, and he indicated that one of the speakers that was on the list was Dr. Chedi Jagan, who was the leader of the PPP. Dr. Jagan, having been on the list, was something which the main party and Mr. Burnham was not pleased with. And he indicated that his cousin, Hamilton Green, told him that the boss, who was Mr. Burnham, wanted to see him. Mr. Green took him to see Mr. Burnham, and at that particular meeting, what happened was Mr. Burnham told him that he had to remove Dr. Jagan from the list of speakers. Mr. Omowali said he was not going to do that because they had permission from the police to hold the rally and to use the loudspeakers, and he was not going to allow the pressure from anyone to let them alter who they wanted to have speak at that meeting. He indicated that Mr. Burnham's words to him was, "The meeting will not take place." And then he further went on to say that during that meeting, he was more or less offered the position, even a ministerial position, where Mr. Burnham told him that everyone has a price. He said that that is not true, and he politely declined the offer. When the meeting was indeed held, and he did the introductions and he invited Dr. Jagan up on stage, he said a thug who he believes was sent by Mr. Burnham, went on stage, took the mic away from Dr. Jagan, and proceeded to hit him with it. And the meeting thereafter was broken up because there were other thugs present who broke up the meeting. What this goes to show is a contrast in relation to the testimony of Takuma Ogunse. When Takuma Ogunse gave his evidence, he indicated that there were two sacred cows. And that is why today there was reference to the two sacred cows. The two sacred cows who were identified was indeed Dr. Jagan and UC Kwayano. And according to Mr. Gunse, when he had given evidence, these two individuals were protected. They were not to be touched because they were seen as sacred cows. Clearly, this is one example, an eyewitness example where Dr. Jagan was indeed targeted, and he did in fact suffer physical violence on his person because he was invited to speak up on stage. After that, Mr. Omowali went through his own personal harassment, and these instances were meted out by the state and the Burnham-led administration. What he told the commission about was his right to travel was taken away. He was supposed to go to Rome to speak, and he did not get to go to do his consultancy because they took his passport, they kept him in a room until the plane left. There was also another incident where his wife and his children, who were minors at the time, were on a flight coming into the country, and they were not allowed to enter into Guyana. In fact, they were put back on the plane and they had to leave. When inquiries were made as to why this was done, first they were told the children were not allowed to come to Guyana. And secondly, when the attorneys called the Commission of Police to find out, they said there was a problem with his wife. She was the one that was not supposed to come. And he said she and the children had come previously and there were no problems. we found out that it was not until after the death of Walter Rodney and after sometime 1982 that they were allowed to come back. What is evident is that he finds that time as being one of oppression and one of a dictatorship. He describes these events and his own personal experience as being the reason for him holding the opinion and the belief that Dr. Walter Rodney was indeed assassinated. These are his words, that he believes that Dr. Walter Rodney was assassinated by the Burnham-led administration. And that was a constant thread throughout his entire testimony. He even went on to speak about how it was the WPA, his position of organizing secretary, and the duties he had to do. One thing to note is that they also held lectures. He was responsible for organizing the lectures, and he had to hold some of these lectures in pastures in the dead of the night using a torchlight, and he even spoke about walking through cow dung one night. What this goes to show is that they were not free at that time to meet in public and to have these lectures and discussions, and they were planned in such a way that they were done in the dead of night, where you do not expect a lecture to be carrying on in the middle of the night and in a pasture. So all of his experiences that he has shared with the commission go towards showing that the WPA members and supporters were discriminated against, and even his own family. He said his father basically ostracized him because of his non-support of the PNC and choosing to support the WPA. Further to that, he said that he had heard that his cousin, Mr. Green, would have made a statement at a meeting that even his cousin, if they're not with us, even his cousin would not be spared. Now, what this goes to show, and Ms. Brown mentioned, is that there is no discrimination in the discrimination, even whether you are connected by blood or if you are connected by some affinity, because he went to school with some of these men. And still, that did not affect the discrimination and the harassment and the oppression he felt because of the fact that he was a supporter of Walter Rodney and a member of the WPA.